October 15th, 2023. The warehouse in Detroit had been silent for 3 hours. Vince Sterling stood in front of 40 crew members, ready to destroy the actor who dared challenge him. He'd done this dance 1,000 times. Humiliate talent, remind everyone who holds the power, watch them crumble. "You think you're untouchable," Vince sneered into the microphone. "You think your little method acting makes you special." The actor looked up, said 5 words that turned Vince's blood to ice. "I know about Marcus Chen." The name hit the warehouse like a gunshot. Marcus Chen, the stuntman who died on Vince's last film. The death Vince had buried. The secret that destroyed careers. 40 witnesses watched Vince Sterling's empire crumble in real time. What they didn't know was that this actor had spent 5 years planning this moment, every word calculated, every revelation timed. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The microphone feedback screamed through the converted warehouse as Vince's hand trembled against the stand. Marcus Chen, a name he'd buried so deep he almost believed it had never existed. Almost. The actor who'd introduced himself simply as Jack 3 weeks ago remained perfectly still in his chair, stage makeup half removed, one eye still bearing the scar from today's fight scene. His gaze never wavered from Vince's face, and in that stare was something Vince recognized from his own mirror, the patience of a predator. "I don't know what you're talking about," Vince managed, his voice cracking like a teenager's. The crew shifted uncomfortably. Camera operators, gaffers, script supervisors, 40 pairs of eyes waiting for their legendary producer to regain control, to unleash the volcanic fury that had made him infamous from Malibu to Manhattan. Instead, Vince Sterling stood frozen. Jack rose from his chair with fluid grace, still wearing the torn leather jacket from their noir thriller. Blood, fake blood, Vince reminded himself, stained the collar. March 18th, 2018, Soundstage 7 at Pinnacle Studios. You told Marcus the safety cable was optional for the rooftop sequence. The warehouse seemed to shrink. Vince's vision tunneled until all he could see was Jack's face, pale under the harsh LED work lights. How could he know the exact date, the exact stage? Those details had been scrubbed from every report, every testimony, every official record. "You're fishing," Vince whispered. But even he didn't believe it. Jack took a step closer, then another. The crew parted like water, sensing something primal unfolding. Marcus was 28, had a 6-year-old son who watched every movie Daddy worked on, collected action figures of the heroes his father helped bring to life. Vince's knees threatened to buckle. The son, Christ the son. He'd sent flowers to the funeral white lilies that cost more than most people's monthly rent. Anonymous, of course. A gesture that had helped him sleep for exactly 1 night before the nightmares returned. "Security footage was corrupted," Jack continued, his voice carrying the weight of absolute certainty. "Union rep was bought off. Stuntman coordinator transferred to London the next day, very clean, very professional. Very Vince Sterling." The producer's mind raced through calculations he'd perfected over 3 decades in Hollywood. Damage control, spin, deflection. But this wasn't a gossip columnist fishing for quotes or a rival studio spreading rumors. This was surgical precision, delivered by someone who'd done his homework. "What do you want?" Vince asked. Jack smiled for the first time since arriving on set 3 weeks ago. It was the kind of smile that belonged in their noir film, beautiful and terrible and absolutely without warmth. "I want to finish the movie, Vince. Our movie. About betrayal and justice and the price of power." He gestured toward the elaborate set they'd constructed, a replica of a 1940s office building, complete with fire escapes and rooftop access. "It's a beautiful story, don't you think? Very authentic." The pieces clicked together with sickening clarity. The script Jack had proposed a noir about a corrupt mogul who murders an innocent man and covers it up. The insistence on practical stunts. The warehouse location isolated from prying studio executives. The fact that Jack had financed the entire production through a shell company Vince couldn't trace. This wasn't a film. His hands shook as he pulled out his phone, muscle memory guiding him to a contact he'd called every night for the past 5 years. "Elena?" His voice cracked like old leather. "Vincent, it's past midnight. Are you—" "I'm fine." The lie tasted bitter. Through the phone's speaker he could hear the soft sounds of his daughter's bedtime routine in the background, teeth brushing, pajama drawers sliding shut. Normal sounds from a normal life, a million miles from this warehouse tomb. "Is Sophia asleep?" "Almost. She drew you another picture today, a dragon with a producer's hat. Elena's voice carried that careful neutrality she'd perfected during their divorce proceedings. She wants to show it to you this weekend. Vince closed his eyes, seeing his 8-year-old daughter's gap-toothed smile. Sophia didn't know about the scandals, the buried footage, the stuntman named Marcus Chen. To her, Daddy made movies where heroes always won and monsters always lost. She'd never questioned why Daddy lived in a small apartment now instead of the Malibu house with the infinity pool. "Vincent, you still there?" "Yeah, He stared at the elaborate sets surrounding him, the mock office building, the fire escape that would feature prominently in tomorrow's stunt sequence. Jack had insisted on building it to exact specifications. Now Vince understood why. "Elena, if something happened to me, would you tell Sophia that everything I did was for her?" Silence stretched across 3 time zones. Elena lived in Portland now with her software engineer boyfriend, as far from Hollywood as she could manage without leaving the continent. "What kind of question is that?" Her voice sharpened. "Vincent, are you drinking again?" No, he wasn't. Hadn't touched alcohol since the night Marcus Chen died, when he'd emptied an entire bottle of Macallan and still couldn't stop seeing that young stuntman's face in the security monitor. I love her, Elena. Whatever happens, make sure she knows that." "You're scaring me. Where are you?" Vince looked around the warehouse at the noir sets that would be his confession booth and possibly his tomb. Work, always work. After hanging up, he sat in the oppressive quiet, breathing in the scent of sawdust and paint that always reminded him of his first job of PA on a B-movie Western shot in a Burbank parking lot. He'd been 22 then, hungry and fearless, convinced he'd revolutionize cinema. When had that hunger curdled into greed? When had cutting corners become second nature? Marcus Chen's face materialized from the shadows between sets, not the broken, bleeding version from Vince's nightmares, but the living, man-earnest brown eyes, calloused hands that spoke of years working construction before Hollywood, a wallet photo of a dark-haired boy with his father's smile. That boy would be 13 now, old enough to understand what had happened to his father, old enough to plan revenge. Vince's phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. Tomorrow's call time moved to 6 a.m. "We have a lot to accomplish." J attached was a photo that made Vince's blood freeze. Marcus Chen's helmet camera, the one supposedly destroyed in the fall, sitting on a pristine white desk. The timestamp read, March 18th, 2018, 2:47 p.m. Exactly when Vince had told Marcus to skip the safety cable because they were losing light, and the studio was breathing down his neck about overages. Another buzz, another photo. This one showed a legal document custody papers dated 6 months after Marcus's death. Chen, Marcus deceased. Son, Jonathan Marcus Chen. Guardian, Ellen Chen, grandmother. Jonathan, Jack. The pieces clicked into place with surgical precision. A sound echoed from the darkness between the set's footsteps, slow and deliberate. Jack emerged from the shadows, now dressed in street clothes, his stage makeup completely removed. Without the theatrical facade, he looked younger, vulnerable, like the 6-year-old boy who'd lost his father to Hollywood's machine. "He used to practice his stunts in our backyard," Jack said quietly, settling into a chair 20 feet away. "Built a whole obstacle course out of plywood and rope, said he wanted to make sure he never let down the heroes he was helping create." Vince's throat constricted. "Jack, my name is Jonathan Chen. I thought you should know who's directing your final performance." The warehouse lights flickered, casting dancing shadows across the sets. In that unstable illumination, Vince saw his future stretching ahead, every scene a reckoning, every stunt a choice between confession and damnation. Tomorrow filming would resume. The show, as Jack said, must go on. The silence stretched between them like a taut wire, broken only by the industrial hum of the warehouse ventilation system. Vince stared at Jonathan Chen, no longer Jack. Never again Jack seeing Marcus's features reflected in the young man's angular face. The same determined jawline, the same dark eyes that seemed to catalog every detail. "How long?" Vince's voice emerged as barely a whisper. "How long have I known? Since I was 8. Jonathan leaned back in his chair with studied casualness. "Grandma Ellen tried to protect me from the details, but children are excellent investigators when they want to understand why Daddy isn't coming home." Vince's phone buzzed against his thigh, a text message, then another. The notifications felt like pinpricks against his skin as Jonathan continued talking. The official story never made sense. Dad was obsessive about safety protocols, drilled them into me from the time I could walk. He'd check his equipment 3 times before hanging a picture frame, but supposedly he forgot to use a safety cable on a 40-foot drop. The phone kept buzzing. Vince pulled it out with trembling fingers, seeing message after message from an unknown number. Photos, documents, video thumbnails that made his vision blur. Marcus Chen personnel file. Note the commendations for safety excellence. Insurance payout records. Delayed for 8 months pending investigation. Union meeting minutes discussing systemic safety violations on Sterling Productions. Each image felt like a nail in his coffin. Vince's thumb hovered over the screen, afraid to scroll further but unable to stop himself. "I spent 5 years learning everything about you," Jonathan said, his voice carrying the patient tone of someone explaining a simple math problem. "Your methods, your pressure points, insurance investigators' notes before they were mysteriously reassigned." He tossed the envelope onto the craft services table. It landed with a sound like thunder in the oppressive quiet. And of course, 4 hours of Marcus's helmet camera footage, showing exactly what you said to him that day. How you threatened to blacklist him from every studio in town if he didn't hurry up. How you personally removed his safety cable because it was taking too long to rig properly. Vince's knees buckled again, but this time he forced himself to remain standing. 30 years of Hollywood warfare had taught him that showing weakness was suicide. Even now, even with the walls closing in, his survival instincts kicked in. "You can't use any of that," he said, grasping for leverage. "Obtained illegally, fruit of the poisonous tree, no court would—" "Who said anything about courts?" Jonathan's smile returned, that terrible expression of absolute certainty. He walked past Vince toward the exit, his footsteps echoing like gunshots in the cavernous space. "See you at 6 a.m., Vince. We have a movie to finish." The warehouse door slammed shut with a finality that reverberated through Vince's bones. Alone with the ghosts of his choices, he stared at the manila envelope, knowing that whatever it contained would change everything. There was no going back now. Vince's hands trembled as he reached for the manila envelope, then pulled back as if it were radioactive. The warehouse felt colder now, the industrial heating system no match for the ice in his veins. He could walk away, leave the envelope unopened, drive back to his studio apartment, and pretend none of this had happened. But Jonathan Chen wasn't bluffing. 30 years of reading actors had taught Vince to distinguish between performance and truth, and everything about Marcus's son radiated the quiet certainty of someone holding a royal flush. His phone rang, shattering the silence. The caller ID showed a number he recognized, his agent, Barry Kellman, probably calling to discuss the morning's shooting schedule. Normal Hollywood business, as if the world hadn't just tilted off its axis. "Barry, it's late." "Vince, thank Christ, I've been getting calls." Barry's voice carried that particular strain reserved for crisis management. "Weird fucking calls, some reporter from Variety asking about Marcus Chen. You remember that stuntman who died on Crimson Vendetta? They wanted to know if you had any comment about new evidence in the case." The envelope seemed to pulse on the craft services table like a beating heart. "What did you tell them? What do you think I told? No comment, go fuck yourself, call our lawyers." "But Vince," Barry's voice dropped to a whisper, "how the hell does anyone still care about that? It's been 5 years. The case was closed. The insurance was settled. What new evidence could there possibly be?" Vince closed his eyes, seeing Jonathan's face with perfect clarity. The careful way he'd studied every reaction, cataloged every tell. This wasn't random. The reporter's call had been timed to coincide with tonight's revelation, another layer of psychological warfare. "I don't know," he lied. "Probably just some conspiracy theorist with too much time on their hands." "Maybe. But Vince, if there's anything at all that could come back to bite us, I need to know now. The studio's already nervous about you being back in business. One more scandal and you're fucking radioactive forever." After hanging up, Vince walked to the window overlooking the Detroit skyline. The city's lights twinkled, like dying stars, beautiful and distant. He thought about Sophia, probably dreaming about dragons and fairy tales in her Portland bedroom. Would she still draw him pictures when this was over? Would there be an after at all? His phone buzzed again, a text from an unknown number, but he knew the sender. "Check your email." Jay Vince's laptop sat on a nearby equipment case, its screen dark. He powered it up with shaking fingers, dreading what he'd find. His inbox showed one new message with a video attachment. The subject line read, "Marcus Chen, March 18, 2018, unedited." He clicked play before his courage could fail him. The video opened with a first-person view from Marcus's helmet camera. Vince watched himself from 5 years ago, younger, heavier, radiating the casual arrogance of absolute power. The audio was crystal clear as his past self barked orders at the stunt team. "We're losing light. Every minute costs us 10 grand. On screen, Marcus's voice was respectful but concerned. "Mr. Sterling, the safety cable isn't properly secured. Give me 5 more minutes to fuck the cable. You've done this stunt 100 times. Just make the jump and let's wrap this." Vince watched himself physically disconnecting Marcus's safety line, his movements quick and irritated. The timestamp showed 2:47 p.m., exactly 18 minutes before Marcus Chen fell to his death. The video stopped there, frozen on an image of Vince's face twisted with impatience. Below the video player was a simple message: "Thinking about tomorrow's scene?" Vince slammed the laptop shut, but the damage was done. He'd watched his own confession, preserved in high definition for posterity. The evidence wasn't just damning, it was irrefutable. He grabbed his car keys and headed for the exit, desperate to escape the warehouse's suffocating atmosphere. But as he reached his BMW, he found the windshield decorated with a single red rose and another note: "Running away won't change tomorrow's call time. 6 a.m. sharp." The drive back to his apartment passed in a blur of streetlights and growing panic. Vince's mind raced through possibilities: fleeing to Mexico, calling the FBI, hiring private security. But each option crumbled under scrutiny. Jonathan had spent years planning this. Every contingency had been considered, every escape route blocked. In his empty apartment, Vince poured 3 fingers of bourbon, then remembered his promise to Elena and poured it down the sink. Alcohol wouldn't solve this. Nothing would solve this. He sat on his couch, staring at the framed photo of Sophia on his coffee table. In 6 hours, he'd have to return to that warehouse and face Jonathan Chen again. He'd have to pretend to direct a film while knowing it was really his trial, his jury, and quite possibly his execution. The show must go on. But Vince was no longer sure he'd survive the final act. "Jonathan's the smartest kid in his class," Marcus had said during a lunch break, showing wallet photos to anyone who'd listen. "Wants to be an actor someday. I told him Hollywood's got enough pretty faces, be the guy who makes the pretty faces look good." The memory felt like a blade between his ribs. Vince remembered nodding politely, already mentally moving on to the next shot, the next problem, the next corner that could be cut to save time and money. Marcus Chen had been talking about his son's dreams while Vince calculated how to use him more efficiently. At 5:30 a.m., Vince's phone rang. The caller ID showed Detroit PD. "Vincent Sterling?" The voice was professionally neutral. "This is Detective Sarah Kovac, Detroit Police. We've received some information regarding a 2018 incident in Los Angeles. We'd like to speak with you at your earliest convenience." Vince's throat constricted. "I'm not sure what incident you're referring to." "Marcus Chen. Ring any bells?" The line went quiet, except for Vince's labored breathing. Jonathan wasn't just playing psychological games. He was building a legal case in real time. While Vince had been paralyzed by shock, his tormentor had been making phone calls, sending evidence, constructing a web that would survive even if something happened to its architect. "Mr. Sterling, you still there? I need to speak with my attorney before—" "Of course, but Mr. Sterling, don't leave town." The call ended, leaving Vince staring at his reflection in the black phone screen. His face looked haggard, older than his 58 years. The man staring back wasn't the Hollywood power broker who'd once greenlit $100 million pictures. He was a cornered animal, desperate and running out of options. Vince arrived at the warehouse at exactly 6 a.m. to find Jonathan waiting by the craft services table, casually eating a bagel as if they were old friends meeting for breakfast. The manila envelope sat beside him, open now, its contents spread across the table like tarot cards predicting doom. "Sleep well?" Jonathan asked without looking up. "The police called." "I know." Jonathan bit into his bagel with deliberate slowness. "Detective Kovac seems very thorough. She was particularly interested in the insurance payout timeline." Vince's hands clenched into fists. "You're destroying innocent people." "The insurance company, the studio executives who signed off on the settlement, they had nothing to do with this." "No," Jonathan agreed, finally meeting his eyes. "But they all had something to do with covering it up afterward." Amazing how quickly everyone rallies around a shared lie when there's money involved. The first crew members began trickling in, their cheerful morning greetings a surreal counterpoint to the conversation. Vince watched them prepare for another day of filming, completely unaware they were extras in a revenge tragedy that had been 5 years in the making. "Today we're shooting the office building sequence," Jonathan continued, standing and brushing crumbs from his shirt. "The scene where the protagonist realizes he's been betraying everything he claims to believe in. Very meta, don't you think?" Vince's phone buzzed with a text from Barry. "Variety is running a story tomorrow. New evidence emerges in Hollywood stunt death. We need to talk, now." Another message appeared immediately below it. This one from Detective Kovac interview scheduled for 2 p.m. today. "Please bring counsel." Jonathan was reading over his shoulder, no longer bothering to hide his omniscience. "Busy day ahead, but don't worry, we'll wrap the morning scenes before your appointment. I'm very respectful of people's schedules." "Why?" The word erupted from Vince with surprising violence. "Why not just turn the evidence over to police 5 years ago? Why this elaborate fucking theater?" Jonathan's composure cracked again, revealing the molten core of rage beneath. "Because 5 years ago I was a 13-year-old kid who'd just lost his father to your negligence. Because the system failed him then, and it would have failed him again. Because justice isn't just about punishment, it's about understanding. Really, truly understanding what you took from us." He gestured toward the film sets around them. "You've spent your whole career telling stories about consequences, about heroes and villains and the price of choices. This is your chance to live in one of those stories instead of hiding behind them." The crew was fully assembled now, waiting for direction. Camera operators checked their equipment while the script supervisor marked her pages. Everyone looked to Vince expectantly, still believing he was their director, their leader, their authority figure. "Places everyone," Vince heard himself say, the words emerging automatically after 3 decades in the business. "Let's make a movie." But as he walked toward his director's chair, he caught sight of his reflection in a darkened monitor. The man staring back looked like Marcus Chen trapped, resigned, already beginning to fall. But as they repositioned for the second setup, Vince noticed details he'd missed before. The script supervisor wasn't just marking pages, she was photographing them with her phone between takes. The key grip had positioned lights in configurations that seemed designed more for surveillance than cinematography. Even the craft services assistant was documenting everything, her casual snapshots capturing Vince's every reaction. "How many of them are working for you?" Vince asked during a lighting change. Jonathan adjusted his costume without looking up. "Working for me? They're all just doing their jobs, Vince. Good people trying to make an honest living." He paused, letting the implications settle. "Unlike some producers we could name." That's when the first revelation hit Vince like a physical blow. This wasn't just an elaborate revenge scheme. Jonathan had infiltrated the entire production. The crew wasn't complicit, they were unwitting documentarians creating a comprehensive record of Vince's psychological breakdown in real time. His phone buzzed with another text from Detective Kovac interview moved to 11 a.m. "New evidence requires immediate attention." "Jesus Christ," Vince whispered, the timeline accelerating beyond his control. "How long have you been planning this?" "Since the funeral," Jonathan replied, his voice carrying a matter-of-fact tone that made the words more chilling. "I was 13 watching them lower my father into the ground while you gave interviews about tragic accidents and industry-wide safety improvements. That's when I realized the system wasn't broken, it was working exactly as designed, protecting people like you while people like my father became acceptable casualties." Vince's hands trembled as he reached for his director's chair, needing something solid to anchor himself. The warehouse seemed to spin around him as memories from 5 years ago crashed into his consciousness with brutal clarity. He remembered now, not just Marcus's death, but what had happened afterward. The lawyers descending like vultures, the insurance investigators, asking pointed questions until they were mysteriously reassigned, the studio executives who'd assured him everything would be handled quietly, the stuntman's union representative who'd accepted a generous settlement in exchange for dropping their formal investigation. "You think you were the only one covering your tracks?" Jonathan continued, his performance seamless even as he destroyed Vince's world. "Every single person who helped bury this has received documentation of their role in the cover-up. The insurance adjusters, the studio heads, the union officials, everyone who chose money over justice." The second revelation struck with devastating force. Vince hadn't been the mastermind of the cover-up. He'd been its willing participant, certainly, but also its primary victim. While he'd believed he was orchestrating his own salvation, other people had been orchestrating his downfall, using his guilt and desperation to construct an even more elaborate web of lies. "The studio never intended to protect you," Jonathan said, reading the comprehension in Vince's face. "They needed a scapegoat when the story eventually broke. Someone with enough reputation to satisfy the media but not enough current power to fight back effectively." Vince sank into his chair as the full scope of his naivety became clear. He'd spent 5 years believing he'd escaped justice through cunning and connections. In reality, he'd been handed just enough rope to hang himself when the time was right. "Places for scene 12, the assistant director called, consulting his shooting schedule with professional detachment. "She needs me." "My father had a son," Jonathan replied without missing a beat. "He needed him too." The parallel was devastating in its simplicity. Vince saw Sophia's face, in his mind her gap-toothed grin, her crayon drawings taped to his refrigerator, her absolute faith that Daddy was one of the good guys. How would he explain this to her? How would he explain any of it? "Mr. Sterling," the assistant director approached hesitantly. "We're ready for the next setup, but—" he gestured toward the crew, who had stopped their work to stare at their director. "Is everything all right?" Vince realized he'd been standing motionless for several minutes, script pages clutched in his white-knuckled fists while his world crumbled around him. The crew's faces showed concern mixed with professional anxiety. They had a schedule to maintain regardless of whatever personal crisis their director might be experiencing. "5-minute break," Vince announced, his voice hoarse. "Everyone take 5. As the crew dispersed, Vince found himself alone with Jonathan in the shadow of a fake office building constructed from plywood and good intentions. The irony wasn't lost on him. Everything in this warehouse was make-believe except for the most important thing happening here. "You know what the worst part is?" Vince said, surprising himself by continuing to engage. "I actually liked your father. He was a good man, professional, dedicated, never complained about the long hours or the dangerous work." Jonathan's composure flickered, the first crack in his armor that Vince had managed to create. "Don't. He talked about you constantly, showed everyone pictures, bragged about your grades, your school plays. He was so proud." "Stop." The word came out sharp enough to cut. "He said you wanted to be an actor. Guess you got your wish." Jonathan's face went deadly pale, his carefully constructed control finally showing stress fractures. "You don't get to talk about him. You don't get to humanize him now after 5 years of pretending he didn't matter. He did matter." The admission escaped before Vince could stop it, raw and unfiltered. "He mattered, and I killed him anyway because I was too fucking selfish and impatient to let him do his job properly." The words hung in the air like smoke from a discharged weapon. Vince had never said them out loud before, not to his lawyers, not to his therapist, not even to himself in the deepest hours of the night. But now they were out, irretrievable, documented by whatever recording devices Jonathan had undoubtedly planted throughout the warehouse. Jonathan stepped backward as if he'd been slapped, his entire carefully orchestrated performance suddenly off balance. "You think confession absolves you? You think admitting guilt makes this better?" "No," Vince said, and for the first time in 5 years he felt something like clarity. "I think it makes it true. And I'm tired of living in fiction." He looked around the warehouse, taking in the elaborate sets Jonathan had constructed, not just the physical facades, but the emotional ones. The fake production company, the manufactured crew relationships, the carefully scripted conversations. All of it designed to force this moment, this admission, this reckoning. "You want me to direct your confession," Vince continued, understanding flooding through him like cold water, "but you've already directed mine. This whole thing, the midnight revelations, the police calls, the script parallels, it's all been one long scene designed to break me down until I told the truth." Jonathan's mask slipped completely, revealing something Vince hadn't expected to see: uncertainty. For 5 years the young man had imagined this moment, planned for it, rehearsed it, but now that it was happening, the reality felt different than the fantasy. "The truth doesn't bring him back," Jonathan said quietly. "No," Vince agreed, "it doesn't. But maybe it lets us both stop pretending he never existed." The warehouse fell into an eerie quiet, the kind of stillness that follows a lightning strike pregnant, with electricity and the promise of thunder. Vince could hear the crew murmuring in distant corners, their voices a low hum against the industrial silence. But here, In this circle of manufactured reality, only two men existed, the destroyer and the destroyed, though which had become impossible to determine. Jonathan's face cycled through emotions like a broken projector, images flickering too fast to process. The certainty he'd worn like armor for 5 years was cracking, revealing something vulnerable underneath a 23-year-old man who'd built his entire adult identity around this single moment of confrontation. "You don't understand," Jonathan said, his voice smaller now, almost pleading. "I've been him for so long. Marcus Chen's son, the boy whose father died because of Vincent Sterling's negligence. I don't know who I am without that." Vince studied the young man's face, seeing past the performance for the first time. "What's your real name?" The question seemed to physically stagger Jonathan. He opened his mouth, closed it, opened it again. He swallowed hard. David Chen. The name hung between them like a bridge neither had expected to find. David Chen. Not Jonathan, the calculated avenger, but David, a son grieving his father, a boy who'd grown up too fast in the shadow of tragedy and injustice. "David," Vince repeated, tasting the humanity in it. "Your father talked about you constantly. Said you were going to change the world. Stop." But there was no venom in it now, only exhaustion. "He carried your photo in his wallet, the one from your 8th grade graduation. You were wearing his tie. He said it was too big, but you insisted because you wanted to look like him." David's carefully constructed composure finally shattered. Tears cut tracks through the makeup that had transformed him into Jonathan, washing away the mask of calculated vengeance to reveal the raw grief beneath. "I was going to show him my first real performance, high school production of Hamlet. He promised he'd be there front row no matter what. The night he died," Vince said, understanding flooding through him. "He was trying to finish early so he could drive back for your play." "You killed my father for a fucking schedule." The words came out broken, devastated, "because you couldn't wait one more day, couldn't accept that some things matter more than your convenience." The accusation hit Vince like a physical blow, but for the first time in 5 years he didn't flinch from it. "Yes, I did, and I've been killing myself ever since, one sleepless night at a time." Around them, the fake sets seemed to shimmer and dissolve, revealing the warehouse's true nature, vast, empty, echoing with the ghosts of industrial purpose. The crew had gone quiet, perhaps sensing the seismic shift occurring at the center of their production. "I can't take it back," Vince continued, his voice gaining strength. "I can't undo the choice I made or bring your father home to see you perform. I can't give you back your childhood or your innocence or your faith that the world is fundamentally just. But I can stop letting his death be meaningless." David wiped his eyes, smearing the makeup further. "What does that mean?" "It means no more cover-ups, no more lawyers or NDAs or carefully worded statements. It means I tell Detective Kovac everything, not just what happened that night, but who helped bury it afterward. Every studio executive, every insurance investigator, every union official who chose money over justice." The offer landed between them like a grenade with its pin pulled. David stared at Vince, searching for deception, for some final manipulation. But Vince felt empty of tricks, hollowed out by truth. "They'll destroy you," David said quietly. "They already did. I just didn't realize I was already dead." Vince pulled out his phone, scrolled to Detective Kovac's contact information. His thumb hovered over the call button as 5 years of carefully constructed survival instincts screamed at him to stop, to think, to find another way. But he was tired of thinking, tired of surviving, tired of being the man who'd let Marcus Chen fall because waiting one more day had seemed impossible. "This won't bring him back," Vince said, looking at David's tear-stained face. "But maybe it'll let you stop being the boy whose father died and start being the man your father would have been proud of." He pressed call. The phone rang once, twice. On the third ring, Detective Kovac answered with crisp professionalism. "Detective Kovac." "This is Vincent Sterling," Vince said, his voice steady. "I'd like to confess to the murder of Marcus Chen." David gasped, the word murder hanging in the air like smoke. Around them, the warehouse held its breath as past and present finally, inevitably, collided. Vince looked at his phone as if seeing it for the first time, then slowly lowered it to his side. The call had lasted less than 30 seconds, but it had cleaved his life into 2 distinct halves, before and after. Everything that came next would be measured from this moment. David stood frozen, his face cycling through disbelief, vindication, and something that might have been relief. Around them, the warehouse had become a cathedral of silence. the crew unconsciously gathering at the edges of the space like witnesses to something they didn't understand but recognized as momentous. "It's done," Vince said, the words feeling strange in his mouth. Not foreign exactly, but unfamiliar-like, speaking a language he'd forgotten he knew. The fake office walls suddenly looked absurd, cardboard and dreams propped up by 2x4s and good intentions. 5 years of carefully constructed lies had been dismantled by a single phone call, leaving only the truth in their wake, raw, undeniable, and strangely peaceful. "I thought it would feel different," David whispered, staring at Vince as if he were an apparition. "What would feel different? Winning, getting justice, having you finally admit what you did." David's voice carried wonder and disappointment in equal measure. "I imagined this moment for so long, but I never thought it would feel so empty, sad." David wiped his eyes again, the gesture childlike despite his 23 years. "I spent 5 years hating you, and now I just feel tired." Vince understood. The weight he'd carried since Marcus's death hadn't disappeared with his confession. It had transformed into something else, something cleaner but no less heavy. Accountability, perhaps. The burden of truth instead of the burden of lies. In the distance, sirens began their lonely wail, growing louder as they approached the warehouse. Vince thought about Sophia, probably asleep in her bed 3 time zones away, dreaming whatever innocent dreams 7-year-olds dream. Tomorrow she would wake up to a different world, one where Daddy was in jail, where the fairy tale of their perfect weekends together had been revealed as just another story he'd told himself to avoid facing reality. "I have to call my daughter," Vince said, the practical considerations beginning to assert themselves. "And my lawyer, though I suppose that's pointless now." "Will you tell her the truth?" The question stopped Vince cold. How do you explain moral complexity to a child? How do you tell someone who still believes in heroes and villains that the world is painted in shades of gray, that good people can make terrible choices and live with the consequences forever? "I'll tell her that Daddy made a mistake that hurt someone, and now he has to take responsibility for it," Vince said finally. "When she's older, I'll tell her the rest." David nodded, understanding something in that answer that went beyond their immediate circumstances. "My father used to say that growing up was just learning that everyone you thought was invincible was actually just pretending they knew what they were doing. Your father was a wise man." "Yes, he was." The sirens were close now, maybe 2 blocks away. Soon this warehouse would be flooded with detectives and crime scene technicians and reporters who had somehow caught wind of the story. The careful privacy of this moment would shatter into a million public fragments, dissected and analyzed until the human truth at its center was lost in procedural noise. But for now, in these final seconds of before, Vince allowed himself to feel something he hadn't experienced in 5 years. Peace. Not happiness. He would probably never be truly happy again. But the deep, bone-deep relief of a man who had finally stopped running from himself. "Thank you," he said to David, meaning it completely. David looked surprised. "For what?" "For caring enough about your father to do this. For refusing to let his death disappear into paperwork and legal settlements. For making sure he mattered." The young man's face crumpled again, but this time the tears seemed cleaner somehow, less about rage and more about love. "He did matter. He mattered so much." "I know," Vince said, and for the first time in 5 years he truly did. "I know." The warehouse doors burst open, flooding the space with Detroit police officers and the harsh glare of late afternoon sunlight. As the handcuffs closed around his wrists, Vince caught one last glimpse of David standing among the abandoned film equipment, no longer the calculating avenger who had orchestrated this confrontation, but simply a son who had finally brought his father home. Outside, the city continued its eternal rhythm of decay and renewal, indifferent to the small human dramas played out in converted warehouses. But inside, 2 men had found something resembling grace in the wreckage of their shared tragedy. Not redemption, perhaps, but recognition that even the worst choices could be transformed into something meaningful if faced with sufficient courage. The story would stay with everyone who witnessed it, not because of its violence or its vengeance, but because of its final, unexpected tenderness.